March 12, 1928. San Francisco Canyon, California. Before we dive into the terrifying pitch-black waters of one of the deadliest, most preventable engineering disasters in American history, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and like this video. While you do that, let me take you back to a time when the rapidly growing city of Los Angeles was dying of a desperate, unquenchable thirst. In the 1920s, Los Angeles was booming. Millions of people were flocking to the sunny paradise, but there was one massive existential problem. The city was built in a harsh, dry desert. They desperately needed millions of gallons of water to survive and expand. Enter William Mulholland, a self-taught, legendary Irish immigrant who became the absolute titan and head engineer of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Mulholland was seen as a hero who had already built the massive Los Angeles aqueduct. But to secure the city's future, he needed a massive backup reservoir. He needed a monument to his own genius. So he designed the St. Francis Dam. It was a colossal, curved concrete behemoth, standing almost 200 feet tall and stretching 700 feet across the rugged canyon walls, holding back over 12 billion gallons of water. But there was a chilling piece of forgotten history. For centuries, the local indigenous tribes, the Tataviam people, had warned that San Francisco Canyon was cursed and geologically unstable. They purposefully never built their permanent villages in the bottom of that specific gorge. But the ambitious engineers of the 1920s didn't listen to ancient folklore. They trusted math, steel, and their own massive egos. During the grueling construction phase, hundreds of laborers worked day and night in the blistering California sun. They poured over 130,000 cubic yards of heavy concrete into the canyon. But Mulholland, blinded by his own past successes, completely ignored the basic laws of geology. He built this massive heavy concrete structure on a foundation of ancient unstable rock known as paleosol and schist, a type of rock that literally dissolves and turns to slippery, wet mud when submerged in water. For 2 entire years, the massive reservoir slowly filled behind the concrete wall, completely unaware of the deadly, catastrophic failure that was quietly brewing deep beneath the foundation. As the water level rose closer and closer to the very top, the massive concrete face of the dam began to show deep, concerning temperature cracks. But Mulholland brushed them off as normal settling. The true terror began on the morning of March 12, 1928. The reservoir was completely full for the very first time. The dam keeper, a hard-working man named Tony Harnischfager, who lived in a small wooden cottage right at the base of the massive dam with his family, noticed something deeply terrifying. A new, massive leak had sprung from the western abutment. But this wasn't just clear water leaking through the concrete. It was dark, muddy water. Muddy water meant the very foundation of the canyon was washing away from underneath the dam. Frantic and terrified for his family's life, Tony immediately called William Mulholland in Los Angeles. Mulholland and his assistant rushed up to the canyon that very morning to inspect the massive leak. They walked across the top of the towering structure, looking down at the muddy water trickling into the canyon below. Any modern engineer would have immediately ordered an emergency evacuation and a massive draining of the lake. But Mulholland, stubbornly confident in his own indestructible design, stared at the muddy leak and officially declared the dam to be perfectly safe. He told Tony not to worry, got back into his chauffeured car, and drove back to Los Angeles. It was a fatal, arrogant miscalculation that sealed the horrific fate of hundreds of innocent, sleeping people. As the sun set over the rugged California landscape that evening, the people living in the small farming communities down the canyon went to sleep, completely unaware that a 12 billion gallon monster was about to be unleashed upon them in the pitch black of night. As the clock ticked toward midnight, an eerie, heavy silence fell over San Francisco Canyon. The only sound was the gentle rustling of the wind. But at exactly 2.5 minutes before midnight, 11:57 p.m., the ancient, unstable rock foundation completely gave way. There was no warning siren. There was no time to run. The mountain simply dissolved. With a deafening, earth-shattering roar that survivors miles away mistook for a massive earthquake, the colossal concrete wall of the St. Francis Dam catastrophically broke apart. Massive, solid concrete blocks weighing over 10,000 tons each were violently thrown down the canyon like fragile plastic dice. In a fraction of a second, 12 billion gallons of freezing heavy water were violently unleashed into the narrow gorge. It created a terrifying, pitch-black tsunami, an apocalyptic wall of water standing a staggering 140 feet high, the equivalent of a 14-story building. This wasn't just a flood, it was a dark, roaring, liquid avalanche moving at an astonishing speed of 18 miles per hour. The sheer kinetic energy of the massive wave was incomprehensible. It instantly swallowed Tony Harnisch-Fager and his family in their cottage, erasing them from existence before they even woke up. The terrifying water wall tore through the darkness, stripping the canyon entirely down to the bare bedrock. It ripped massive ancient oak trees completely out of the ground and tumbled them in the freezing water, turning the tsunami into a deadly, grinding blender of timber, heavy mud, and massive chunks of concrete. Just 5 minutes downstream sat Powerhouse Number 2, a major hydroelectric facility where dozens of workers and their families lived in a small, tight-knit community. The 120-foot wave violently slammed into Powerhouse Number 2 with the force of an atomic bomb, completely obliterating the massive concrete facility and instantly crushing the 73 homes in the workers' village. Out of the 129 people living there, only 3 miraculously survived by clinging to the steep, rocky cliffs in the pitch black. The massive wave then continued its relentless, unstoppable rampage down the canyon, completely wiping out the high-voltage power lines and plunging the entire region into absolute, terrifying darkness. The monster then hit the wider Santa Clara River Valley, spreading out to be over 2 miles wide as it roared toward the sleeping towns of Castaic Junction, Fillmore, Bardsdale, and Santa Paula. The only hope the sleeping residents had were the heroic telephone operators and night shift police officers working down the valley. One of the most legendary stories of survival belongs to a heroic motorcycle police officer named Thornton Edwards. As the massive wave approached the town of Santa Paula, Edwards received a frantic call. He didn't evacuate to save himself. Instead, he kicked his heavy police motorcycle into gear and rode directly toward the danger. He became known as the Paul Revere of the St. Francis Dam. He rode frantically through the dark, quiet streets, his siren wailing into the night, stopping at every corner to fire his service revolver into the air to wake the sleeping residents. He rode until the freezing, muddy water was literally lapping at the tires of his motorcycle, saving hundreds of lives by mere seconds before the wave swallowed the neighborhoods behind him. Because of the absolute darkness, many fleeing families could only hear the terrifying, deafening roar of the approaching wave, completely unable to see the massive wall of mud and debris until it was literally crushing their homes. Whole families climbed onto the roofs of their wooden houses, only to feel the entire structure lift off its foundation and violently spin into the raging, freezing torrent. People clung desperately to floating mattresses, rooftops, and telephone poles for hours in the freezing night, fighting to keep their heads above the thick, suffocating mud as they were swept miles away from where their homes once stood. At exactly 5:25 in the morning, over 5 hours after the massive concrete dam had exploded, the terrifying wave of mud, debris, and human tragedy finally emptied into the Pacific Ocean. When the water finally receded, it left behind an alien landscape. The once fertile agricultural valleys were buried under 10 feet of thick, suffocating gray silt that hardened like cement under the California sun. The force of the water was so incredibly violent that victims were found buried in the mud miles out into the ocean, washing up on the beaches weeks later. The flood had carved a 54-mile path of total ruin, claiming the lives of over 400 innocent people. But the tragedy didn't just wash away towns. It completely erased the very people who had maintained the dam. Right at the base of the massive concrete structure, tucked into the narrowest, darkest part of the Rocky Canyon, was a temporary camp. It housed the maintenance workers, laborers, and their families in small, flimsy wooden cabins. When the 12-billion-gallon monster broke free, this camp was the absolute first thing to be annihilated. The wave didn't just crush the camp. The sheer, unimaginable friction of the water and grinding concrete blocks completely pulverized it. Rescuers later couldn't find a single trace of the buildings, the heavy machinery, or the dozens of souls who had been sleeping there. They were simply wiped from the face of the earth in less than a heartbeat. And then there was the eerie, unsettling aftermath of the ruined dam itself. In the weeks and months following the apocalyptic flood, the disaster site turned into a morbid, dark tourist attraction. Thousands of curious onlookers drove up the ruined, muddy canyon roads just to stare at the terrifying, towering middle section of the dam that miraculously survived the collapse. It stood nearly 200 feet tall in the middle of the empty, scoured canyon like a giant, haunting gray tombstone. People would actually climb the massive, unstable concrete steps of the ruins to take photographs, completely oblivious to the deadly danger. The situation became so incredibly dangerous, and the visual reminder so profoundly traumatic for the grieving survivors down the valley, that the city of Los Angeles finally had to take drastic action. In 1929, government demolition crews rigged the massive, haunting tombstone with hundreds of pounds of heavy dynamite. With a final, deafening explosion that echoed down the tragic canyon, they blew the cursed ruins to dust, hoping to finally bury the nightmare once and for all. During the agonizing coroner's inquest, William Mulholland was a completely broken man. The once arrogant titan of engineering sat in the crowded courtroom, completely stripped of his pride. When asked to testify, he famously wept, looking at the grieving families, and said, "Fasten it on me. If there is an error of human judgment, I am the human." He lived the rest of his days in deep isolation. The tragedy forever changed American civil engineering, forcing the creation of strict, independent safety regulations for massive dams. Now I turn the question to you. If you were awoken in the dead of night by a deafening roar echoing through your valley, what would be your absolute first instinct? Have you ever lived near a massive dam or reservoir, and does it ever make you nervous? Let us know your thoughts and stories in the comments below. And if you made it this far into the story, thank you so much for watching America Retold. Your history is America's history, and we want to hear it.